The sky was the color of a dying ember, bruised and flat, with no warmth to speak of. The wind hissed through the cottonwoods like it held a grudge, slapping at the hem of Nayeli Bencomo's threadbare skirt as she crouched beside her daughters. One clung to her hip, the other to her arm, both too cold to cry. Their cheeks were sunburned and raw, their eyes wide and hollowed from miles on foot. Behind them, the trail they'd followed from Mora was just a thin, broken line carved in hard-packed dirt and regret. A wooden gate loomed ahead, iron latch rusted but intact. Beyond it stretched acres of silent land, tumbleweed drifted like lost souls, and a small ranch house stood at the end of the narrow path, smoke barely curling from its crooked chimney. A barn, weather-worn and leaning, hunched to one side like a tired old man. No voices, no dogs, no welcome, just stillness. Nayeli pulled Esperanza tighter to her chest. "You hush now," she whispered. "Mama's gonna knock." Her heart hammered, but her hand was steady. She opened the gate and stepped through like a trespasser at the edge of judgment. Each step in the gravel was a reckoning. She reached the porch and paused. It was the quiet that frightened her most. Her last knock in Las Vegas had earned her a bruised shoulder and 2 nights under a slaughterhouse eave. She touched the raw edge of her courage and knocked. Footsteps sounded behind the door. Slow, even. Then the creak of old hinges, and the man who opened it looked like he hadn't said more than 3 words in a decade. His eyes were dark, his beard unkempt, and a scar like a jagged stitch ran from his cheekbone into his collar. His flannel shirt was tucked but frayed, his boots planted like roots. She straightened. "We don't need much," she said, voice thin as frost. "Just somewhere we won't freeze tonight." He stared at her, then the girls. Luz looked up at him without blinking. Esperanza buried her face in Nayeli's shawl. Silence stretched long enough for her to feel her knees tremble. "Please," she added softer now. "We'll move on at first light." He leaned his shoulder against the frame, eyes unreadable. Barns warm, haze dry, no smoking, no noise. She nodded fast. "Gracias." He turned without another word, leaving the door open. She moved quickly, half carrying the girls past him. The heat from the hearth brushed her shoulder like a forbidden kindness as they passed through into the yard again. Inside the barn, Nayeli found the hayloft. It smelled of dust and old grain, but it was dry and shielded from the wind. She laid the girls down and covered them with her shawl, using her own threadbare skirt as extra blanket. She didn't lie down, just watched the crack in the boards, where moonlight peeked in, and held her breath like it might shatter. The girls slept hard. She sat with her back against the stall wall, hands curled around her knees. Every sound outside felt like a footstep toward them. Every silence felt like judgment. She hadn't told the rancher her name. He hadn't asked. In the house, Joaquin Reyes stood with a tin mug in one hand, staring out the back window. The wood stove ticked. He hadn't planned on anyone finding this place, not since the accident, not since they'd buried Esperanza, his fiancée, under the cottonwood grove. A cruel coincidence that the child bore her name. He could have sent them away. Probably should have. Winter wasn't kind out here, and the world didn't have patience for charity. But there was something in the way the woman had stood, shoulders stiff, not broken, and in the way the girl had met his eyes without fear. That girl had seen things, more than most grown men could stomach. He drank the rest of his coffee cold and set the mug down. He wouldn't sleep tonight. By sunrise, Nayeli had managed to doze off in snatches. When she opened her eyes, Luz was already awake and drawing pictures in the dust on the barn floor with her finger. "Bird," Luz whispered. "Mama, it's a bird." She smiled, brushing hair from her daughter's eyes. Maybe it means a good day. Joaquin appeared at the barn door without warning, his shadow stretching long across the floor. Nayeli sat up quick, brushing hay from her dress. He tossed a small sack toward her feet. Cornmeal, beans, firewood stacked outside the house. You can cook behind the barn where the pit is. Nayeli blinked. You mean, we can stay? He stared at her again. You're not bleeding. The girls ain't sick. But I see bone in their cheeks. One night's mercy won't fix that. We can work, she said quickly. I can clean cookmen fences if needed. I won't take anything we don't earn. He nodded once. You can stay till morning. After that, we'll see. Then he turned and walked away. Nayeli let out the breath she'd held for hours. She cooked with shaking hands, built a fire with what little tinder was dry. The girls ate slowly, carefully, as if the food might vanish if they chewed too fast. That night, wrapped in smoke and warmth, Nayeli told them a story her mother used to say about a woman who planted seeds in a land that didn't want her, and the roots grew anyway. Later, after the girls were asleep, Nayeli stepped outside. The moon had climbed high, washing the land in silver. The wind had eased. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the ranch house where a single lamp flickered in the window. She didn't know the man's name, but he hadn't shut the gate when they came in. Somewhere deep in her ribs, something loosened just a thread. Not enough to call peace, but enough to stay through the next dawn. Inside the house, Joaquin sat at the kitchen table with his old ledger open in front of him. His pencil hovered over the edge of a blank page. He didn't write anything. Not yet, but he drew a quiet line between the last entry and a new one. He didn't know their names either, but they were still here. And that was the first thing that had changed on this land in years. You can stay till morning, Joaquin said at last. After that, we'll see. That was how the sun rose over a second day. The words hung between them like fog clinging to fence posts, uncertain, damp, not quite warm. Nayeli took them as permission, though they felt more like a test. She rose before the girls, stepping outside the barn into the crisp hush of early light. The snow had crusted thin overnight, tracing the fence lines with frost. Smoke already curled from the ranch house chimney, steady and sparse. She gathered her shawl tighter and walked toward the stacked firewood. There was no one outside, but the axe was lodged in the chopping block, fresh splits of pine scattered nearby. She took an armful of wood and carried it back behind the barn, where the fire pit weighted blackened stones circling a patch of ash. The cast iron pan sat upside down on a flat rock, washed clean by snow. She worked quickly, kneeling, flint-striking hands, trembling more from hunger than cold. When the fire finally caught, she let herself breathe. She cooked quietly cornmeal in water and portioned it thin, stretching what she could. She had no salt, but she whispered grace into the steam rising off the pan. The girls emerged, rubbing sleep from their eyes, drawn by the warmth. Nayeli handed each of them a tin cup and a flat wooden spoon. They ate sitting on hay bales, legs swinging, saying nothing. Esperanza pressed her cheek to Nayeli's arm, content just to be near the fire. When they finished, Nayeli cleaned the pan, returned it to the stone, and stood. "I'm going to find work," she said to Luz. "Stay with your sister. Stay in the barn if the wind picks up." Luz nodded with solemn seriousness, and Nayeli kissed their hair and left before her resolve could crumble. She followed the worn trail toward the house, each step harder than the last. The porch creaked under her weight. She knocked once, twice. The door opened slower this time. Joaquin stood there with a cup in his hand and eyes still unreadable. He didn't speak. I can sweep cook patch clothes, Nayeli said. If there's fence needing fixing, I'll try. I don't want to just take. His gaze shifted, flicking toward the barn, then back to her. You know horses, she shook her head. Mules, once. Don't matter, long as you don't spook 'em. He stepped back and left the door open. Nayeli didn't wait to be told twice. Inside the house was spare and dark wood stove ticking softly. A kettle hissed gently on the stovetop. A plate with 2 biscuits sat untouched on the table next to a thick ledger and a worn pencil. There were no photographs, no lace curtains, no warmth but the fire. Joaquin pointed to the sink basin. Water comes from the well. Stovepipe clogs sometimes. Floor needs sweeping. Don't touch the ledger. Understood. He returned to the table and sat thumbing a page with a calloused finger like she'd already disappeared. Nayeli worked. She drew water. She scrubbed the basin. She swept the floor, found a cracked cup under the cot near the wall, and washed it too. When she reached for the broom again, she paused, then picked up the biscuits and placed them in a clean cloth. I'll bring these to the girls, she said. Joaquin didn't look up. They don't owe me thanks. I'm not teaching them about owing, she replied. Just decency. His hand stilled on the page, then a quiet nod. Back at the barn, the girls were chasing a chicken that must have wandered in through a missing slat. Luz shrieked with laughter. Esperanza clapped with delight, and Nayeli froze at the sound of their joy, bright and fragile, like something rare found in the dirt. She let them be for a moment. Then she called them over and offered the biscuits. That night she boiled beans outside. Joaquin came to the fire just as she was ladling the first serving. You eat yet? She asked. He shook his head. She handed him a tin bowl and another biscuit. He didn't thank her, but he sat on a nearby log and ate in silence, the firelight flickering over the deep lines of his face. When the girls finished and curled up together inside the barn, Nayeli stayed near the fire, slowly turning the empty pan in her lap. They slept in hay last night, she murmured. It's dry, Joaquin said. Mice keep clear. She looked up at him. It's not a complaint. He drank from his mug. The silence stretched again. This time she didn't rush to fill it. Then he said, almost as if to himself, I built that barn for horses. Never thought it'd house children. Nayeli rubbed her hands together. I never thought I'd beg for a roof either. Joaquin nodded slowly. Life doesn't ask what you planned. She met his eyes. Only what you can live through. They both sat like that for a while, letting the wind whistle low through the brush, letting the fire crackle and die down. He rose first. Tomorrow, if you're staying, there's a broken gate near the orchard. Needs looking at. I can fix it. He started walking, then paused. Just don't go past the cottonwood grove. Why he didn't answer. Just kept walking. As his footsteps faded, Nayeli stared into the last coals. She hadn't expected warmth, but she hadn't expected gentleness either, not here. Not anymore. Still it had come. Rough-edged and quiet, but unmistakable. Behind her, the girls stirred in their sleep, and deep in her gut she felt something begin to turn. Not hope, not yet, but a place where hope might be allowed to rest, if only for one more day. These aren't the kind of wounds that bleed, Tia Marisol said. They're the kind that make women disappear. The snow had melted into the ground overnight, leaving the ranch in a state of half-thaw and stubborn frost. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady stream, and the wind had gone quiet for once, giving the land a hush that felt too still, like the moment just before glass cracks. Nayeli leaned against the barn wall, one arm braced above her head. Her knees had buckled only once that morning, but once was enough. She'd meant to sweep the ash pile behind the pit and stack kindling before breakfast. But halfway through standing, the world went soft at the edges. And the next thing she remembered was Luce shaking her shoulder with tear-wet hands and saying, "Mama, you're breathing like a horse." Now her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She didn't want Joaquin to see. "Back in," she whispered to Luce, gently nudging her toward the barn. "You keep Esperanza warm. Mama's just catching her breath." Luce hesitated. She didn't ask questions, but she lingered, her little shoulders squared, like she was ready to fight the whole ranch if need be. Then at last she ducked through the stall door. Nayeli stayed upright until the crunch of boots on gravel warned her she wasn't alone. She turned slowly, bracing. But it wasn't Joaquin. It was Mateo. He came walking across the yard with his hat tipped low and a small bundle tucked under one arm, cloth-wrapped and careful like something breakable. His beard was peppered with gray, his jacket patched at the elbows, and his eyes were the kind that didn't miss much. "You're pale as cotton," he said, "and standing like you got hollows where bones should be." "I'm fine," Nayeli said quickly. "Just winded. Winded women don't forget to blink." She didn't answer. Her jaw was set too tight. Mateo sighed and glanced toward the house. "Joaquin in there brooding with that damn ledger. I haven't seen him since sunup." "I have." He took her elbow gently, not like she was weak, but like someone who understood what it meant to fall in private, and led her toward the house. "I'm fine," she repeated, but her voice betrayed her. He didn't argue. Inside the kitchen, the fire was low but warm, and the table held 2 mugs and a half-peeled orange Joaquin had left untouched. Mateo sat Nayeli down on the bench and unwrapped the bundled dried meat cornbread and a flask of broth. "You eat," he said. "Then we call Marisol." Nayeli froze. "No, don't bother anyone. Please." Mateo looked at her eyes, sharp now. "You got 2 girls and a thread of breath holding you up. That's not survival. That's slow dying." She clenched her teeth, but her hands reached for the cornbread anyway. He rose without another word and left through the back door. She ate in silence. By the time Marisol arrived, the light had shifted golden and low. She came in wrapped in a long wool shawl, the color of riverstone, her hair braided down her back and fastened with a strip of copper. Her eyes were the kind that had seen births, deaths, and everything heavy in between. She did not scold. She sat beside Nayeli like a neighbor resting after chores, and waited until the silence bent toward her. "I can't pay you," Nayeli said quietly. "I don't take coin from women running on prayer and pride," Marisol said. "You're not a patient. You're a sister who forgot she still matters." Nayeli's throat tightened. "I didn't forget. I just stopped believing it counted." Marisol took her hand. Her fingers were warm and dry. "These aren't the kind of wounds that bleed," she said. "They're the kind that make women disappear." Nayeli didn't speak. Her shoulders began to shake before her breath did. When she finally cried, it came out soundless and shuddering, as though it had been waiting at the edge of her ribs for days. Marisol didn't hush her. She wrapped the shawl around both of them and let her cry in peace. Later, as the sun dipped behind the western ridge and the world turned copper, Marisol brewed tea from herbs she carried in a pouch. She handed Nayeli a mug and reached for a salve in her basket. "You've been working through fever," she said. "No wonder the sky feels like it's spinning." Nayeli's fingers tightened on the mug. "I didn't want to seem weak." "You aren't. You're a mother in a land that doesn't make room for softness. That's not weakness, that's war." Nayeli stared into the tea. "I can't fall apart. They need me." Marisol smiled gently. That's why I'm here. So you can fall apart a little, just enough to heal. The barn door creaked outside. The girls' voices rang faint and clear. Joaquin's boots crossed the yard and stopped at the threshold. Marisol looked toward the door, then back to Nayeli. He's not the sort who understands words yet, but he knows silence. You let him do what he does best, watch and protect without needing thanks. Nayeli rose slowly. Do you think we'll be allowed to stay? Marisol studied her with a look that seemed to weigh more than the question itself. You're already part of this place, she said, whether he knows it or not. Nayeli nodded, not because she was sure, but because it felt like something worth believing in. That evening, Joaquin found the fire lit behind the barn and a pot of bean stew warming gently. He sat across from Nayeli without invitation. She passed him a bowl without asking. They didn't talk, but he noticed the soft wrap around her wrist and the way her daughters curled against her like roots to a trunk. He didn't ask about Marisol, and she didn't mention the way her hands had stopped trembling. The stars came out early. The fire cracked low. Tomorrow there'd be fences to mend and an orchard full of brittle limbs needing tending. But tonight something had been stitched that no one could name. And it held. You shouldn't sleep with animals, Joaquin said. The bunkhouse is warmer. The words came out gruff, like he regretted them the moment they crossed his lips. He stood at the barn door, hat pulled low, the morning light behind him, cutting his frame into hard lines and soft shadows. Nayeli blinked up at him, hay clinging to her skirt, and her younger daughter still curled beside her like a kitten burrowed for warmth. Luz sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, while Joaquin remained a still figure in the threshold, like he might disappear if anyone thanked him. Nayeli rose, brushing hay from her sleeves. You're offering us the bunkhouse. It's dry. Stove works. No one's used it since fall, he muttered. Smells like turpentine and old boots, but better than manure. She didn't smile, though part of her wanted to. We'll take it. By mid-morning, Nayeli had scrubbed the bunkhouse down with a lye-soaked rag and elbow grease that made her arms tremble again. Joaquin brought over a sack of salt flour and a threadbare wool blanket without speaking, setting it on the porch with a nod. Luz opened the single-pane window and let sunlight in for the first time in months. Esperanza ran in circles around the potbelly stove, giggling at her own echo. There were 3 cots inside, and though the bedding was stiff and mouse-chewed, Nayeli mended the tiers and layered pine boughs beneath the mattress, ticking to freshen the smell. That night, the girls slept on one cot together, and Nayeli laid on the other, staring at the ceiling, where a knot in the wood looked like an eye. She didn't close her own for hours. The next morning, she stepped out to find Joaquin standing near the fence line, watching the eastern edge of the orchard. He didn't speak when she approached. I heard branches cracking in the night, Nayeli said quietly. Coyote. Maybe, he replied, or wind snapping dead limbs. She looked past him. The orchard stood in neat, tired rows. Some trees leaned like old men after hard seasons. Others were brittle silhouettes against the winter sky. They need pruning, she said. Can I help? He gave her a sidelong glance. Know how to trim for spring bloom. I helped a neighbor back in Mora. Her apples were half wild, but we got fruit by fall. He hesitated, then nodded. Tools are in the shed. Watch your hands. Loppers bite meaner than dogs. By noon, Nayeli had her sleeves rolled and sap sticky on her palms. She worked slow, checking each branch before cutting. She taught Luz how to carry twigs to the pile, and Esperanza followed behind with her little hands full of leaves. Joaquin worked farther down the row, his movements efficient but not rushed. When she reached the 6th tree, she found the soil darker, richer. The roots ran deeper here. She knelt and placed her palm flat to the earth. "You've got good land," she said aloud. He didn't answer for a long time. Then quietly, "It wasn't always." After supper, she left 2 plates on the bunkhouse porch, one for herself, one for Joaquin. She didn't knock, didn't wait, just left them and went back inside. He found them an hour later. He didn't knock either. Just took his and sat on the edge of the porch as the wind picked up. The beans were simple, but she'd added a pinch of dried chile and a bay leaf, and he tasted care in every bite. He looked toward the bunkhouse window. A child's drawing was stuck there, charcoal figures with stick arms and wide, crooked smiles. One of them had a hat like his. He didn't smile, but something tugged in his chest. The next few days passed like that quiet slow marked by acts rather than words. Nayeli worked the orchard. Joaquin fixed the busted hinge on the bunkhouse door. The girls gathered smooth stones and made a border around a patch of dirt Nayeli planned to turn into a kitchen garden come spring. One evening, she returned from the orchard with windburn on her cheeks and sap on her hands. She found the girls playing near the fence with a rope Joaquin had tied between 2 posts for them to practice balance. Luz was walking across it like a tightrope, arms out, laughing. Esperanza clapped from the ground. Joaquin stood nearby watching from a distance. Nayeli didn't interrupt. She just leaned on the porch post and took in the sight. That night she laid out 3 plates. One stayed on the bunkhouse table. The second went to the girls. The third she carried across the yard and set on the ranch house steps. When she turned to walk away, the door opened. "You don't have to," Joaquin said. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." He stared at the plate, then nodded once. She didn't see him eat it, but in the morning, the tin plate was scrubbed and set neatly beside the firewood stack. That same day, as she finished hanging washed linens behind the barn, Joaquin appeared at her side, unexpected as always. "Garden'll need fencing if you plant near the bunkhouse," he said. "I was planning to. Chickens get bold." He nodded, then hesitated. "There's a roll of wire in the shed. I'll help you run it." She looked up at him. "Thank you." He met her eyes and said nothing, but the set of his shoulders told her it wasn't obligation. By the time dusk settled that evening, the first post was in the ground, and the quiet between them had shifted, less a barrier now, more a space that held promise. Later, Nayeli sat on the cot, mending a torn hem, while the girls slept tangled in each other's arms. She could hear the faint sound of boots on the porch, pacing once, then twice. Then stillness. She didn't peek, but she knew the plate had been taken again. And when she stepped outside to breathe under the moonlight, she saw something unexpected. The old lantern by the shed, burned out for weeks, now glowed faintly, its wick trimmed aflame, steady in the cold night air. Not a word had been spoken, but something had been said. "Did someone leave you too?" Luz asked him just like that. It was a rare warm afternoon in late winter, the kind that teased the land into thinking spring might come early. The orchard shimmered with soft light through bare branches, and the scent of thawing soil hung low in the air. Joaquin had been mending a corner post, hands deep in damp earth, when he heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind him. He turned his head slightly to find Luz standing a few paces back, hands clasped behind her, a crooked flower crown of brittle wild sage tucked around her hair like a halo. She blinked up at him, solemn and curious. He wiped his palms on his trousers and squinted at her. "You ain't supposed to sneak up on folks with tools in their hands." "I didn't sneak," she replied. "You were just too quiet." He couldn't argue that. She stepped closer, looking at the line of fence he'd just set. "Mama says quiet people hear more than loud ones." "Does she?" Luz nodded, toeing a patch of thawed mud. "She says you listen like the wind." Always there, but you only show up when something changes. He grunted. It wasn't a laugh, not quite. But the sound came from the back of his throat, and Luce took it as encouragement. She sat on a rock near him and fished a pebble from her coat pocket. It was smooth and gray, shaped like a teardrop. She offered it to him without explanation. He took it without a word. "My papa used to carry one like that," she said. Said it reminded him to keep his temper. Joaquin turned the stone in his fingers, its surface cool against his palm. "Did it work sometimes?" Her voice dropped. "But then he got sick. Mama tried to help, but he got too weak. He died last winter." Joaquin let the silence settle. Luce stared at the sky, then back at him. "Did someone leave you too?" The question hit him harder than expected. Not sharp, just sudden like a gust catching you mid-step. He looked down at the stone again. "Yes," he said, finally. "Someone did." Luce didn't blink. "Did it make you quiet?" He thought for a moment. "No, I was always quiet. But after, I guess I didn't have anything left to say." Luce didn't look away. "Did it hurt all the time?" "Yes. Does it still?" He looked out at the orchard, the branches bare but strong, some days. Luce nodded like she understood. "Mama doesn't cry much, but her eyes do." He glanced at her, then sharp and sudden. "What do you mean?" "She looks away when she thinks we're not watching, like something's heavy behind them." Joaquin nodded slowly. "Sometimes grown-ups don't know where to put their hurt, so they carry it in their eyes. Do you think she's still scared?" "Yes, but she's brave too." Luce seemed satisfied with that answer. She stood, dusted off her skirt, and tilted her head. "You ain't scary," she said. "No." She shook her head. "You're quiet, but not mean, like a big tree. Just stands there. But it's always there." Joaquin stared at her a long moment, then reached into his shirt pocket and handed the pebble back. "You keep it," he said, "to remember your papa, and maybe to help your mama carry some of that heavy." Luce tucked the stone back into her coat and smiled. "I'll make her tea tonight." She skipped off, a trail of dust rising behind her like feathers on wind. That night, Nayeli found Luce crouched near the bunkhouse stove, mixing dry leaves and petals into a chipped cup with water warmed over coals. She frowned. "What are you doing, mija? Making you brave tea," Luce said, voice serious. "Like Tia Marisol does." Nayeli knelt beside her, cupping her daughter's face. "Why brave? Because you don't cry. But your eyes do." Nayeli froze. Her lips trembled, but she didn't deny it. She pulled Lou into her arms and held her there, rocking gently. "Who told you that?" Luce pulled back. "Joaquin." Nayeli looked toward the ranch house. A lantern glowed faintly in the side window. Later, when the girls were asleep, she stepped out into the yard, shawl wrapped tight, and walked until her boots crunched outside his porch. He opened the door before she knocked. "You talked to my daughter today?" she asked. He nodded. "She asked questions. I answered." Nayeli studied him. "What kind of questions? About loss, about silence, about you?" She crossed her arms. "She's only 7. She's seen more than most adults." He stepped aside. "Come in. I got coffee on." She hesitated, then followed. The kitchen was dim, warm, and smelled faintly of cedar smoke and ground beans. They sat at the table. "She didn't speak for a long time. She told me my eyes cry," Nayeli said at last. "She wasn't wrong. I didn't mean for her to carry it. She's not carrying it. She's sharing it." Nayeli rubbed her hands together, fingers tight with tension. "You think they're all right, the girls? They're safe. They laugh. They sleep deep. That's more than some get." She looked down. "Luce is too sharp for her age. Esperanza's still too quiet. He poured coffee into a mug and pushed it toward her. Quiet doesn't mean broken. She looked up at him, eyes searching. Neither does being tired, he added. They sat like that, the silence no longer heavy, just full of things that didn't need words. When she left, he walked her to the porch. She turned at the steps. Thank you for seeing them. I see all of you. Her breath caught. Back at the bunkhouse, she found both girls sound asleep, Luz's hand wrapped protectively over Esperanza's. The stone lay on the bedside table beside a drawing, 2 stick figures beneath a tree. One with a hat, one with a shawl. A little house beside them, smoke curling from its chimney. She smiled. For the first time in a long while, it reached her eyes. Running kept you alive, Marisol told Nayeli. But staying will decide who you become. The sun was hard-edged and brittle that morning, casting long blue shadows on the snow-dappled grass behind the orchard. Nayeli stood at the water pump sleeves rolled, scrubbing the girls' dresses in a basin, while steam curled up from the warm water. Her knuckles ached from the cold. Every so often she looked toward the tree line as if expecting something or someone to emerge. Behind her, laughter broke out. Luz was skipping rope with Esperanza's scarf, the little one giggling nearby. The sound made her chest tighten. It was happiness. But happiness in her life had always come with a cost. She returned her attention to the clothes, scrubbing harder than necessary. Later that afternoon, as she hung the dresses on the line behind the bunkhouse, a rider appeared on the ridge, just a small figure on horseback. Moving slow, a dust trail kicked up behind them. Joaquin noticed first. He stepped off the porch, one hand resting lightly near the shotgun by the door, eyes narrowed against the light. It wasn't until the rider passed the wind-battered pine stump that Nayeli froze. Her breath stopped halfway to her lungs. She recognized the gait of that horse, even from this distance. Her stomach dropped like a stone in a well. The man on the horse didn't dismount at the gate, just turned back the way he came, slow and deliberate, making sure he was seen. Nayeli stood motionless, one dress pin in her hand. Joaquin turned to her. You know him, she nodded once, barely. Brother-in-law, she murmured. Rodrigo. Joaquin said nothing at first, just watched the dust settle where the man had been. Then he glanced at the girls playing by the water barrel. You want to tell me what that means? He asked quietly. She looked away. It means trouble's not far behind. Mateo arrived later that day with a parcel of dried peppers and a look like he already knew more than anyone had spoken aloud. Joaquin met him near the woodpile. Saw a rider, Joaquin said. I know, Mateo replied. Word's gone out. Folks in town are starting to whisper. About what? About the woman you took in. Joaquin didn't flinch. Let them talk. Mateo narrowed his eyes. That's not how talk works. It grows legs, especially in places like this. Inside the bunkhouse, Nayeli sat on the cot, sewing patches into Esperanza's worn cloak. Her fingers moved fast, too fast, like her nerves were spilling into the fabric. Marisol arrived not long after Mateo, wrapped in her ever-present shawl, face lined with calm. Nayeli stood when she entered. You felt it too, Nayeli said. Didn't you? I felt the wind change, Marisol replied. And I saw your eyes. I should go, Nayeli whispered, hands clenching in the cloth. Before he brings more, Marisol stepped closer. Why? Because he'll come back. And louder, and meaner, and with paper that says he's got claims. Marisol raised an eyebrow. Claims to what? To Luz and Esperanza. Marisol's gaze didn't waver. They're not livestock, no, Nayeli said, choking, but he'll try and make them seem like it. The healer sat beside her. Do you trust Joaquin? Nayeli hesitated, then nodded. more than I thought I ever would. Then you stay. I don't want him dragged into this. You already brought him into it. Nayeli looked away. Her voice cracked. I didn't mean to. Marisol's tone softened. Running kept you alive, but staying will decide who you become. Nayeli looked up, tears in her eyes. What if I'm not ready for who that is? None of us ever are, Marisol said. We just build her one day at a time. That night, the wind picked up again. Joaquin brought an extra blanket to the bunkhouse, placed it on the porch rail, then lingered a moment before knocking once. Nayeli opened the door. Her eyes were tired, but her spine was straight. You all right? He asked. No, she answered. But I'm staying. He studied her for a long beat, then handed her the blanket. There's an old rifle under the floorboard by the back steps, he said. If you hear anything after midnight, you don't hesitate. I won't. He paused. The girls are safe here. You know that. She nodded. I do. Joaquin walked away into the dark, the lantern light catching the edge of his coat as he disappeared. The next morning, the girls rose early, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the hills. Luz tied her hair in 2 crooked braids and helped Esperanza feed the chickens. The sun broke clean across the fence line, throwing gold across the earth. For a moment, it looked like any other day. But Nayeli's breath didn't come easy. She watched the ridge and waited. Inside the house, Joaquin polished the old rifle Mateo had given him years ago. It hadn't been fired since the last coyote raid on the coop, but something in the air told him this time it wouldn't be animals coming over the hill. He loaded it slowly, then leaned it near the door. Just in case. Outside, the first blackbird of the season landed on the orchard fence, flapping its wings as if testing the air for change. It called once sharp warning. Joaquin looked up from the porch and didn't like the answer. I thought I lost her, Joaquin said hoarsely. Turns out I was just late saving her. The fire started just after dusk, when the wind changed direction and the smell of smoke slipped in under the door of the bunkhouse, like a warning whispered too late. Nayeli had just finished rinsing the girls' feet and was tucking Esperanza under the quilt when Luz sat up fast, nose wrinkling. Something's burning, she whispered. Nayeli froze, sniffed once, then bolted upright. She flung the door open and was hit by a rush of smoke and orange light flickering in the sky beyond the barn. The orchard. Her heart dropped. Stay here, she said sharply. Both of you. Don't open this door for anything unless I come back. Luz nodded quickly, clutching Esperanza, as Nayeli ran her skirt, catching on dried grass and boots, sinking in patches of soft mud. Her lungs burned before she even reached the edge of the yard. The wind was pushing hard against her, blowing smoke in her face as she turned the corner near the old tool shed. Flames licked the side of the small supply shack at the far end of the orchard. It had been dry all winter, packed with wood sacks of feed, oil-soaked rags from the fall harvest cleanup. The perfect trap. She ran faster. Behind her, footsteps pounded the earth. Joaquin's voice barked through the smoke. Get back, Nayeli, but she didn't stop. Inside the shed was a crate where Luz had tucked some drawings and Esperanza's favorite wool doll just 2 days ago while playing. It wasn't rational. It wasn't survival. But it was something that belonged to her daughters. And when everything else in the world had been stripped from them, small things still mattered. She reached the door, heat slamming against her like a wave. She pulled her shawl around her face and yanked the latch just as Joaquin grabbed her from behind and dragged her away, lifting her clear off the ground as she fought. Let me go, she shouted, coughing. No, he growled. You don't go in there. You don't. She left her doll. We can make another damn doll. She sagged in his arms, then suddenly realizing just how hot her skin had become, how close she'd been to stepping into the mouth of something wild and merciless. Joaquin pulled her back behind the garden wall, shielding her with his body, as the roof of the shed cracked and collapsed inward. The fire roared like it was angry. Sparks hissed into the air, and the orchard lit up in bursts of amber and shadow. Mateo appeared out of the smoke with 2 buckets in hand. He tossed water at the dry grass near the bunkhouse, forming a barrier line, while Joaquin took another and helped him soak the shed's perimeter, forcing the flames to stay contained. It took nearly an hour before the last ember surrendered. Nayeli sat on the cold ground knees, drawn up, arms streaked with soot. Her lips were split from heat, but her eyes never left the fire until she noticed Joaquin kneeling beside her. He didn't speak at first. Then, voice low, he said, "I thought I lost her." She looked at him confused. He didn't blink. "Esperanza, my fiancée, years ago. She was 7 months with child. I'd gone to town. The barn caught fire. She ran in after one of the mares. I was late coming back." Nayeli's breath hitched. "I buried her under the cottonwood grove. The stones there, no name carved. I couldn't bring myself to do it." She reached for his hand without thinking. He didn't pull away. "Tonight," he whispered, "when I saw you run into that smoke, I felt it again. That same gut-tearing, bone-deep fear. I thought I'd failed again. But you didn't," she said gently. "You pulled me back." His grip tightened. "I won't let anything happen to you. Or them." Behind them, Mateo finished dousing the last hotspot. He gave Joaquin a quiet nod before slipping away into the night. The girls were still awake when Nayeli returned to the bunkhouse. Luz rushed into her arms, crying hard and silent, her little fists pressed against Nayeli's ribs. "I saw the fire," she whispered. "I saw you run toward it. I thought... "I'm here," Nayeli murmured. "I'm here, Mija. And I'm not going anywhere." Esperanza clung to her leg, pressing her face into the soot-streaked hem of her skirt. Nayeli sat on the cot and pulled them both into her lap, rocking gently. Her skin still smelled like smoke, but her heart finally beat steady. Joaquin stood at the window, outside, one hand resting on the frame. He didn't knock, didn't enter. But he stayed there until the girl's breathing evened, until Nayeli's eyes fluttered shut with hers. The wind had shifted again. The fire had taken what it could, but it had also revealed what hadn't been lost. And in the ashes, something unspoken had begun to root. By morning, smoke still curled faint from the charred wreckage, but the rest of the ranch stood untouched. And for the first time, Nayeli didn't feel like a guest. She felt like she belonged. "If the storm doesn't pass," Nayeli whispered, "promise you won't send us away." The blizzard rolled in heavy and sudden, barreling down from the northern range like a freight wagon of ice. By mid-afternoon, snow fell sideways, thick as cotton, and the wind howled through the orchard, rattling every loose board and hinge on the ranch. The sky was the color of pewter, no light, no direction. Just cold, swallowing everything. Joaquin had nailed shut the barn doors just after noon and helped drag extra kindling and sacks of feed into the bunkhouse before the white curtain made it impossible to see the trail between buildings. Now, hours later, visibility was no more than 5 feet. The world had folded in on itself. Inside the bunkhouse, a small fire glowed in the stove, hissing and popping as pine sap burned slow. The warmth was welcome, but it didn't reach far. They were wrapped in every quilt and blanket they owned. The girls nested together like cubs in the far cot heads tucked under the same scarf. Nayeli sat close to the stove, rubbing her hands and staring into the flames like they could answer questions she'd never dared say aloud. Joaquin was there too, crouched beside the stove, feeding in another split log, with the care of someone who knew exactly how long each piece would last. Outside, the wind howled again, whistling sharp through the seams in the window frame. Nayeli flinched slightly. "It sounds like wolves." "Wolves don't cry like that," Joaquin said. "They don't beg." She turned toward him. "Neither do I." Their eyes met in the half-light. He gave a slow nod, accepting the truth of her without resistance. "I've lived through a lot of winters," she said quietly. "This one feels different." He tilted his head. "Because of the cold, because of what I could lose if I don't stay." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and drew her knees up to her chest. Her voice softened, thinned with fear she hadn't yet named aloud. "If the storm doesn't pass," she whispered, "promise you won't send us away." Joaquin stared at the fire. Then slowly he reached out and placed another log in the stove. The flames leapt caught, filled the space with new warmth. "You're not going anywhere," he said. She let her head bow, and her fingers finally stopped trembling. That night they passed around the last of the dried apples and slivers of cold cornbread. The girls chewing slowly wrapped in quilts. Luz asked for a story, and Nayeli offered one from memory about a mountain fox who got lost in a snowstorm and was guided home by the stars. She made the girls laugh with silly voices, but the whole time she felt Joaquin watching her. Not suspicious, just present. When the girls slept, Nayeli stayed near the stove, unwilling to sleep just yet. "Do you miss her more in the cold?" she asked softly. Joaquin didn't pretend not to know who she meant. He leaned back in the chair near the door, arms folded, coat still on. "I miss her when it's quiet. Winter just gives me fewer distractions." Nayeli studied his face. "Did you ever think you'd have this again?" "No," he answered. "Not in any form." She nodded slowly. "Neither did I. There was a stillness then, not just between them, but in the very walls, the kind of silence that held meaning, not lack, the kind of silence that let the soul rest." The fire crackled low. Snow piled against the bunkhouse door. He finally spoke again. "The orchard will bloom come spring. If we prune right, keep the roots warm." "I want to help," she said. "You already are." She smiled. Then quietly, "You're different than I expected." "How so? You carry pain without passing it on." He didn't know what to say to that. So he nodded, and the silence folded around them again, this time more like a blanket than a barrier. In the morning, the snow was waist-high. No way to open the door without pushing through it with their shoulders. Joaquin and Nayeli dug it out together, one shovel at a time, taking turns, while the girls watched from the window, their breath fogging the glass. It was slow work, but neither complained. By afternoon, the clouds had begun to part. The sun shone through, pale and strained, but real. The world glistened under its light, a smooth white canvas stretching in all directions. Joaquin and Nayeli stood at the cleared path between the house and the bunkhouse, both of them breathing hard, cheeks flushed from the cold and the labor. "I thought we'd be buried longer," she said. "Storms always feel endless until they break," he replied. Luz burst from the bunkhouse door with a squeal, bounding into the snow. Esperanza followed slower, wobbling like a duck on unsteady legs. Nayeli watched them, her heart rising into her throat. "They're happy," Joaquin said. "You did that?" "I didn't do it alone." He glanced at her. "That's the point." She turned to look at him, wind tugging a curl loose from her braid. "Do you think we could stay? I mean, longer than the thaw?" "I'd like that," he said simply. A pause. "Then yes," she said. "We'll stay." As they stood side by side watching the girls fall into the snow, laughing, a hawk passed overhead, silent, steady, a shadow in motion. Neither spoke. but in the snow-crisp air something had been spoken all the same. Spring was coming, and this time they were ready to meet it together. "They belong to me," Rodrigo said. "Blood decides that." It was the first warm day in weeks. The snow had begun its slow retreat, sliding off the eaves, dripping from fence posts, seeping into the thawing dirt. The air smelled like earth again, damp and full of quiet promises. Luz and Esperanza were busy gathering twigs to build tiny shelters near the stump behind the bunkhouse, their laughter rising in bursts. Joaquin was mending the coop roof with a hammer tucked in his belt when the sound of hooves snapped him alert. He straightened, gaze narrowing toward the ridge. A rider. Alone but not slow. He wiped his hands on a cloth and walked down to the gate, his posture calm but coiled eyes sharp. Nayeli stepped out of the bunkhouse with a tin in her hands, ready to scatter cornmeal for the hens. She froze. The rider was close enough now to make out the shape of his shoulders, the familiar tilt of his back, even after all these years. Rodrigo Bencomo, her late husband's brother. A man made of stone and grease and venom, dressed like a gentleman, but never kind. He reined in hard just past the fence, dismounted without grace, and took off his gloves like he was peeling off a mask. "Well," Rodrigo said, voice slick, "ain't this a fine little scene?" Joaquin didn't move. "You're trespassing." Rodrigo ignored him, eyes on Nayeli. "I'd heard rumors. Some traveling woman found herself a little corner of charity. I figured it couldn't be you. You always had too much pride." Nayeli stepped forward, jaw tight. "What do you want, Rodrigo?" He shrugged, slow and casual. "What's mine?" Joaquin's eyes darkened. "You'll speak plain or not at all." Rodrigo smirked. "I'm here for the girls." Nayeli's body snapped tense. "No. They're blood," Rodrigo said. "They belong to me. Blood decides that. They belong to no one," she hissed. "And they sure as hell don't belong to you." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up. "Custodial petition signed by Judge Hoyt out of Mora County. Says here I've got legal claim. Their father's kin, next of blood and more stable standing. Your word ain't worth much when it comes from a shack behind a ranch that's not yours." Nayeli's hands trembled, but she didn't back down. "You didn't care about them when we buried my husband. You didn't care when I was starving with 2 babies and no place to go. Doesn't matter what I did or didn't do," he said. "Law's the law, and the law says I can take them." Joaquin stepped between them, calm and quiet, but unmovable. "Not from here you can't." Rodrigo raised an eyebrow. "You going to stop me with words, rancher? Or that shotgun I heard you keep tucked behind your stove?" Joaquin didn't blink. "You take one step toward them and we'll see which answer you want." Rodrigo's smirk faltered for the first time. Behind them, Luz had stepped into view, holding Esperanza's hand tight. They didn't speak, but the fear in their faces made Nayeli's knees want to give. She turned to them. "Go inside. Now." Luz hesitated just long enough to make her small defiance known, then led her sister inside, closing the door behind them. Rodrigo tucked the paper back into his coat and spat into the dirt. "I'll be back. With a marshal if I need one. You bring whatever name you want," Joaquin said. "But you bring it to me, not her." Rodrigo walked to his horse without another word and mounted reins, snapping. As he rode off, Joaquin watched until the figure was swallowed by the ridge again. Nayeli's breath came shallow. He has paper, Joaquin. He has a judge. So do cowards who don't want to get their hands dirty. She turned toward him. "But what if it's real? What if he really can take them?" Joaquin looked at her, then really looked. "Then he'll have to go through me. And I don't break easy." That night, the bunkhouse was too quiet. The girls lay in bed without protest. Luz clutched the stone Joaquin had given her, eyes wide and dry. Esperanza didn't ask for a story. She just curled closer and whispered, "Don't let that man come back." Nayeli kissed their foreheads. "He won't get past us." She sat outside the bunkhouse long after they fell asleep, shawl wrapped tight, lantern burning low. Joaquin brought over a second blanket and stood beside her, arms crossed. "He's not bluffing," she said. "No. You think he'll come back?" "Yeah." She swallowed. "He'll make noise in town. He'll stir people." "Let him," Joaquin said. "They know who I am. More than that, they know what I stand for." She looked up at him. "And what is that shelter?" "Soil. What's right?" Her throat tightened. "You don't have to stand in front of this, Joaquin. It's not your fight." He crouched beside her, his voice low and even. "Then let me make it mine." She didn't speak. He reached for her hand, calloused palm against her wrist. "You asked me once if we could stay longer than the thaw. My answer hasn't changed." A tear slipped from her eye before she could stop it. "I just want them safe," she said. "They are," he answered. And for the first time in her life, she believed it wasn't a promise made in fear, but a vow made in stone. "They stay," Joaquin said. And that's the end of it. The next 2 days passed under a gray veil. The wind turned restless, birds quieted, and even the cattle seemed to keep to the lower pastures. It was the kind of stillness that warned people who lived by the land something was coming. Joaquin saddled his horse and rode to town early on the third morning, coat buttoned to the neck and rifle slung across his back, not for show, but for weight. The ride into Arroyo Seco was brisk and cold dust rising dry beneath the hooves. By the time he tied off in front of Mateo's place, he could already hear the whispers. The blacksmith paused his hammer. The shopkeeper on the porch of the mercantile stopped sweeping. Everyone had heard. Rodrigo had wasted no time. Inside Mateo's kitchen, strong coffee boiled on the stove, and a stack of letters sat unopened on the table. Joaquin removed his gloves slowly. "He went to the sheriff," Mateo said without preamble. "Claimed you're harboring children you've got no legal tie to. Said the woman's unstable, prone to vanish. Called her a stray." Joaquin's jaw flexed. Sheriff believe him. Mateo poured coffee into a chipped mug and handed it over. "Believing's not the issue. Sheriff doesn't want to be involved. Says it's civil. If Rodrigo brings a writ with a federal stamp, he'll have no choice." "I figured," Joaquin muttered. He sipped the coffee. It burned going down. He welcomed it. Mateo studied him. "What do you want to do, stand my ground?" Mateo nodded once. "Then you're not doing it alone." Joaquin left town by mid-morning with 2 sacks of flour, a few tins of beans, and the understanding that word had spread beyond whispers. Some of the men he'd known for years nodded quiet respect as he passed. Others turned away. Either way, they all knew where the line had been drawn. By the time he reached the ranch again, Nayeli had washed the windows of the bunkhouse, and the girls were sweeping the porch, like it mattered what strangers saw. "Did you speak to him?" she asked as Joaquin dismounted. "No," he said. "Didn't need to. He's already lit the match." "Then what now?" He looked past her to the orchard, to the soil that was finally softening, ready for seed. "We hold our ground." That evening, a wagon creaked up the trail just before sunset. Rodrigo arrived with 2 men, both armed, both strangers, and a sheet of paper held high like a badge. They rode slow, forcing the dust to stir in the yard coats, flapping behind them like warning flags. Nayeli stood on the porch of the bunkhouse, the girls inside. Joaquin stepped down from the house, rifle propped, but unloaded in his hands, more symbol than threat. Mateo was already there, leaning against the side post, shotgun in his arms, and no expression on his face. Rodrigo pulled the paper from his coat and held it out. Legal. Signed yesterday. Marshal's seal, I'm taking them today. No, Nayeli said. Her voice didn't shake. They're my brother's blood, Rodrigo snapped. And you're nothing now. A woman with no house, no standing, and a man not your husband playing daddy with someone else's kin. Joaquin's voice broke the air like thunder. They stay, and that's the end of it. Rodrigo turned slowly toward him. You want to fight this in court? I've got time and money. You've got a ranch that ain't worth the taxes it sits on. I've got more than that, Joaquin said. I've got eyes on me. This town knows who I am, and they know who you are. Mateo straightened. He's telling the truth. You come back with lawmen, that's one thing. But you show up with guns and 2 hired dogs. That's intimidation. And intimidation don't carry well in these hills. Rodrigo looked past them, jaw grinding. From the far side of the pasture, Tia Marisol stood with a hand resting on her cane eyes like smoke and iron. Behind her, the field glowed with early wildflowers, and beside her 2 young men from the Pueblo village had come without speaking, holding fence posts and hammers. Not weapons, just presence. Rodrigo's men shifted in their saddles. Nayeli stepped down from the porch, hands steady, voice firm. You have a piece of paper. That doesn't make you a father. Rodrigo stared her down, but the fire behind his eyes flickered. This isn't finished, he hissed. Joaquin raised the rifle just slightly, not aiming, just resting it across his chest. You're right, but you won't be the one who finishes it. Rodrigo turned, yanked the reins hard, and the wagon rolled out slow and heavy into the dusk wheels grinding in defeat. When the dust settled and the sound faded, Nayeli let out the breath she'd been holding for 3 days. Joaquin walked over to her, not saying anything. She turned to him. That could have gone worse. It still might. But not today. He nodded. No. Not today. Mateo exhaled and looked toward the horizon. Fences hold if you set them deep enough. And if you've got neighbors willing to stand beside them, Joaquin added. Nayeli turned to look at the orchard again, already casting long shadows. They'll come back, she said. Yes, Joaquin replied. But so will we. And they stood there shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun drop behind the hills, knowing the hardest part wasn't over, but knowing too that for the first time they weren't facing it alone. Some things grow because you refuse to pull them up. The orchard was in bloom. A week had passed since Rodrigo's retreat, and though no word had come from the town or court, the tension still clung to the rafters like smoke. But spring, in its own stubborn way, had broken through. Buds opened soft and slow, on every branch white and pink petals fluttering loose like confetti on the wind. The air smelled of fresh grass, river thaw, and wildflowers creeping up the slope beyond the pasture. Nayeli stood barefoot in the garden patch behind the bunkhouse, fingers caked with soil, sleeves rolled above her elbows. She had already planted peas, onions, and a row of sunflowers for the girls. Now she was pressing tomato seeds into the earth with careful reverence. Esperanza played nearby, dragging a stick through the dirt in long loops. Luz stood at the fence edge with a piece of chalk, drawing flowers onto the boards like she could will them into being. Nayeli looked up and caught Joaquin leaning against the corner of the barn, arms crossed, watching them. She smiled, small but sure. He stepped closer. You're quiet today. She patted the dirt over the last seed and sat back on her heels. I like this kind of quiet. Joaquin looked at the furrowed rows, then at the chalk flowers beside the real ones. You think they'll take the seeds or the girls both? She looked toward the orchard. Some things grow because you feed them. Others grow because you refuse to pull them up. He nodded, slow and thoughtful. Then I think we've got a good shot. The days that followed carried the rhythm of rebuilding. The supply shed had been reduced to charred boards and blackened beams, but Joaquin and Mateo had begun salvaging what they could. Marisol visited every few days, bringing herbs, seed cuttings, and news from the village. Even the hens, once unsettled, had begun to lay again. Joaquin had replaced the latch on the bunkhouse door and mended the back step where Esperanza had tripped last month. No one said anything about it, but every small repair felt like a promise. That evening, Nayeli brought supper over to the house. 2 plates of fresh cornbread beans with diced green chile and slices of spring onion from the garden. She didn't knock anymore. She just walked in. Joaquin was sitting at the table, ledger closed, boots muddy from fence work. "You'll spoil me," he said without looking up. She set the plate in front of him. "Then I'm doing it right." He took the first bite without hesitation. "This tastes like something worth staying for." She sat across from him, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. "I've never stayed anywhere this long." "Does it feel wrong?" "No," she said softly. "It feels like it's mine." He looked up at her, then his eyes more open than she'd seen them. "Maybe it always was. You just didn't have a key yet." They ate in the soft hush of the kitchen, a single lantern swinging lightly from the ceiling beam. The walls creaked as the night cooled, but the warmth inside held steady. After supper, she helped wash the plates. Joaquin dried them without a word, setting each one back in its place. They moved around each other easily now, like pieces of the same pattern. "Will you plant apples this year?" she asked, drying her hands. He nodded. "A few. Figured you'd want to choose which rows." "I already have." He smiled into the towel he was folding. "I figured." She turned toward the door, hesitated, then said, "The girls want to paint the bunkhouse. Not white, something warmer." "Let them," he said. "Let it look like they belong." When she stepped outside, she found the girls gathered around Mateo's mule cart, clapping as he pulled out a small wooden chest. "What is it?" Luz asked. Mateo grinned. "Paint, left over from my sister's porch. Red clay and ochre." The girls squealed. Nayeli shook her head with a smile. "You're going to have them thinking every visitor brings gifts." Mateo winked. "Maybe every good one should." By mid-afternoon the next day, the bunkhouse glowed with uneven strokes of red and burnt orange. Joaquin helped hang a new horseshoe over the door. Esperanza pressed her handprint beside it in yellow, and Luz scrawled a heart around all their initials, NJLE, using a broken stick dipped in leftover paint. Joaquin stared at the heart a long moment. "We look like a family. We are," Nayeli said simply. A breeze tugged at her braid, and he stepped closer. "I still have no paper that says you belong here. No legal hold, no claim." She looked up at him. "You gave us more than paper ever could." He reached out and brushed a flake of paint from her cheek. "I want to make it right. All the way. You already are." The wind shifted, slightly warmer now. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird began to sing. Luz called out from behind them, waving a stick like a banner. "Mama, he said we can plant our names in the garden. What does that mean?" Nayeli laughed. "She wants to spell them out with beans," Joaquin explained. "Said if we can grow food, we can grow ourselves." I like the sound of that. They stood side by side, watching the girls dig uneven letters into the dirt sunlight, warming the backs of their shoulders. The paint on the bunkhouse hadn't dried yet. The orchard still needed pruning, and they were still waiting for whatever trouble Rodrigo might send again. But the soil was taking root, and this time it was on their terms. "We didn't find this place," Nayeli said softly. "We made it." The spring festival arrived with birdsong and the smell of fresh tortillas wafting from cook fires down in Arroyo Seco. For the first time in years, the village plaza was hung with bunting and woven streamers draped from poles and beams like stitched ribbons of celebration. Musicians from the pueblo arrived with hand drums and carved flutes, and women lined the benches with woven baskets of bread chili beans and jars of honey. Joaquin hadn't planned on attending, but Nayeli had. She stood outside the bunkhouse with her shawl pinned over her shoulder, the one Luz had stitched with marigolds along the hem. Her hair was braided down her back, and Esperanza clung to the edge of her skirt face, sticky from a stolen peach she'd swiped that morning from the kitchen basket. "You look like home," Joaquin said, coming up behind her. She smiled. "That's the first time anyone's ever said that to me." He offered her a hand. "Ride with me." She took it without hesitation. They rode in on the buckboard Mateo had lent them, pulled by the slowest mule in the territory, and decorated by Luz with a chain of wildflowers and tin charms she'd strung from old buttons. As they passed along the trail, neighbors waved, some hesitantly, others with quiet warmth. Word of Rodrigo's retreat had traveled far, and the way Joaquin had handled it earned nods of silent respect. The plaza was alive by noon. Children raced barefoot through the dust. Old men played cards in the shade, and women traded gossip with arms linked like a chain of belonging. Music rose above the chatter, slow, rhythmic, like heartbeat and wind combined. Nayeli walked through it all with her head-high hand in Joaquin's. Luz carried a paper fan painted with sunbursts. Esperanza sat on Marisol's lap beneath the cottonwood tree, chewing on roasted corn and watching the dancers twirl in loops. No one asked questions anymore. No one whispered. Not today. Mateo waved them over to the long wooden table where the community had gathered to eat. Bowls of tamales, pots of beans, platters of baked squash, and hominy-stacked tortillas wrapped in cloth. Joaquin pulled out a chair for Nayeli. She sat, and Luz crawled into her lap before she could stop her. Marisol leaned across the table. "You built something stronger than walls." Nayeli smiled. "I didn't do it alone. You weren't meant to." Later, as dusk settled and lanterns flickered in the breeze, a circle formed in the center of the plaza. Dancers stepped barefoot onto the hard-packed earth. The flutes quieted. A single voice began to sing, a woman, older, rich with soul and time. A young girl stepped forward, offering her hand to Luz. Luz looked at Nayeli. "Go on," she whispered. Luz beamed, dropped the fan, and ran to join the circle. As the music picked up again, light and laughter swirled beneath the moon. Joaquin turned to Nayeli, his voice low. "Do you miss anything?" She glanced around the girls, dancing the orchard blooming in her memory, the steady strength of the man beside her. "No," she said. "Not a thing." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. Her heart hitched. It was creased and worn. He opened it slowly. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a marriage proposal. It was a page from his ledger. On it, written in his careful, stiff hand, were 4 names: hers, Luz's, Esperanza's, and his. Below them, in capital letters, household. She stared at it, throat tightening. He looked away, sheepish. Didn't know what else to call it. She reached out and touched the page. That's exactly what it is. They walked back to the wagon under a sky full of stars, children drowsy in their arms, the sounds of the festival fading behind them. The trail home was quiet, lit by moonlight and the creak of old wheels. When they reached the bunkhouse, Joaquin climbed down first and lifted both girls gently into his arms. Nayeli stood at the edge of the garden. She looked around the orchard, the house the mountains leaning in like old sentinels and let the night settle into her bones. Joaquin came to her side. She rested her head on his shoulder. "We didn't find this place," she said softly. "We made it." He didn't answer. He just took her hand and held it, and they stood there wrapped in stillness and roots as the wind carried the scent of apple blossoms through the night air. What had once been survival was now sanctuary, and what had begun in silence had grown into a life. The educational lesson learned from this story is that home isn't something we stumble upon. It's something we build with patience, love, and the courage to stay when it's easier to run. Sometimes the most meaningful families are those we choose, not those we're born into. Strength doesn't always show itself in noise or force, but in steady presence, quiet protection, and daily acts of care. For those who've weathered many seasons of life, this story reminds us that it's never too late to grow roots or to become someone's safe place.